Hi, my name is Kiona Chatrapati, and today we are going to look at the topic of search of omnipotence and fulfillment. Namaste. Omnipotence is derived from the Latin word omnipotent, which literally means all power. In psychoanalysis, it is connected to narcissism. Essentially, it is seen as a pathology entity. Today, our psychoanalysis consultant, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya, guides us to look at the concept of omnipotence from a rather unconventional lens. So let us explore this discussion further and see where it leads us. Namaste. Can we start with the genesis and evolution of the term search for omnipotence?
Omnipotence arrives in psychoanalysis early. Freud, when he started developing psychoanalysis for the first time, he arrived at a premise that childhood is the most important part in determination of pathology and healing. So he started to figure out how we can understand how the human mind develops in the childhood. And as he started doing it, the first thing he conceptualized was a state of primary narcissism. And primary narcissism was a state where there was no concept of not I. It was only I, and there was just one unit. The infant had no idea that anything other than him existed. And this oceanic feeling of there being just one whole unit, and there is no idea of not I, there is no idea of the other. And in that state, the grandiosity, the self-sufficiency, the security, the bliss, and the power that is enjoyed and felt leads to this state of omnipotence. So the first point that Freud conceptualized the state of omnipotence was the first state of primary narcissism with which we all start, in his opinion. And after some time, it breaks and we start understanding that other than me, somebody also exists. So the concept of not I comes into being. Now, when the concept of not I comes into being, there are two entities, I and not I. And I, because of the characteristics I have, by virtue of my hardware, I want to attach to people. I want to attach to the other. So the infant tries to attach to the parent, mostly the mother. If it is successful, it takes a different route. However, if it fails, then the approach which was full of love and desire to attach is frustrated. And therefore, the approach which is frustrated results in intense amount of pain, inferiority, and a fear of approaching anybody, and a fear of emotional closeness. And out of that, the infant develops a false self, a false sense of self-sufficiency and grandiosity to overcome the real inferiority and the pain. So the infant tries to attach, the attachment process is frustrated, and therefore the infant gets into a situation of pain, inferiority, vulnerability, dependence, and helplessness. And to come out of it, it develops a false sense of self-sufficiency and grandiosity, and therefore a false sense of narcissistic omnipotence. So this is the second point where Freud talks about omnipotence. He talks about this as secondary narcissism. And normally when we say narcissism, we refer to secondary narcissism in a two-person situation. We don't refer to the primary narcissism, which is a pre-object stage. So Freud creates this, brings in this idea of omnipotence related to a self-created sense of false grandiosity and self-sufficiency, which is created at the end of this attempt to attach to somebody, and it's frustrated, resulting in secondary narcissism. So For Freud, these were the 2 points where omnipotence came in: primary narcissism and secondary narcissism. For Klein, it was slightly different. Klein saw early childhood phase as being a state where the mind thinks in terms of extremes, and the child is relating not to a person but to a part object, which is the breast. So when the breast gives milk, security, pleasure and support, the child thinks it is the all good breast. And when the child wants the breast but the breast is absent, the child cannot conceptualize the concept of absence. So the child believes there is a bad breast which is present. And the child also thinks that the torturous feelings inside because of hunger and emotional loss are not there because of hunger and everything. It is because of something done by the bad breast outside. So the child tries to attack the bad breast in fantasy and then fears that the bad breast will attack back. Now here, the child thinks in terms of extremes. When he thinks of the good breast, it is omnipotent, all good breast. When the child thinks of a bad breast, it is omnipotent, all bad breast. The child does not have as yet the capability to think using ideas like an idea of balance, moderation, synthesis, proportion. He has not yet developed the capability to use these things in his thinking. So it's a very primary extreme thinking. So Klein says that the first point where the omnipotence comes into human mind is when you think of omnipotent all good breast or omnipotent all bad breast. And the second way it comes in is if you identify with the omnipotent all good breast, it can be one of the roots to narcissism. That the ego has identified with the all good omnipotent breast, and now the ego believes it has become that. So this is Klein's conceptualization of it. And the solution, of course, is to bring the two together into a realistic position of synthesis and balance. Give up the extreme thinking. So both the omnipotent good and the omnipotent bad go, and we are left with reality. So for Klein, the movement is from engaging with omnipotence to getting into a position of a synthetic reality, which is neither omnipotence or neither sides. Kohut talks of it in a slightly different way. Kohut says that we are all born with a desire to live out our omnipotence in childhood and to do exhibitionism of all the talents that we have with a desire to be admired by our elders and caregivers. If that does not come, what he calls mirroring, that admiration and acknowledgement of us, he calls it mirroring. If that does not come, then our outward movement towards fame recoils back in a withdrawal, in a frustration, and the movement of fame results in a shame. So what happens is we withdraw into ourselves, and the movement to live out our omnipotence and be admired for it recoils back into an inferiority. What we have there is we go out for exhibitionism, display of grandiosity and admiration, and frustrated come back with shame, inferiority. And if we come back with shame and inferiority, the shame gets into the unconscious. The inferiority also gets into the unconscious. And instead of living out our desires and then moving to a healthy, natural state, we get fixated into that shame and inferiority and develop an outward, fragile, narcissistic self. The difference is, in case of Freud, the first position is almost hardwired in terms of operations. In secondary narcissism, the other comes into play. So it is not all in the mind, the outer world, the other in the outer world does or does not do something to affect us. In client's conceptualization, the role of constitution is slightly higher, but the other is still important. In cohort's conceptualization, the other is far more important than in case of Freud and Klein. So this is how we see omnipotence making its entry into psychoanalysis quite pervasively, even in early days of psychoanalysis and also recently in writings of cohort. Today, if we look at psychoanalysis and we look at the concept of omnipotence, we see it everywhere. Psychoanalysis tells us that we are primarily beings of desire and pleasure. And there is something which is called infinity of desire. That all desires are infinite. And therefore, when we follow this infinity of desire and try to satisfy them and reach a maximalist position, we are essentially in search of the omnipotent. That we want infinite power, we want infinite money, we want infinite looks. So if you put all of that together, what we want is actually omnipotence. So the infinity of desire is yet another deconstructed form of this aggregate omnipotence. And we see it every day, and we see it in primary two ways. In everyday life, we see people pursuing this search for omnipotence in two broad ways. One, in a worldly wise incremental way, that you try to become an assistant manager and then general manager and then CEO, okay, to maximize your money, your position, your fame in society and so on. So you're moving towards omnipotence whatever extent you can in a worldly wise incremental way. Or you take the high risk non-conventional route where you want to become an actor, an actress, a celebrity, a leader, right? A sports person, which is a high risk route. But you don't have the temperament to really go slow and steady and work your way up. That is not your temperament. Your temperament is to be more free and move in a very natural, organic way, not in a structured way. So that is what I call the surreal route to omnipotence. And this includes even becoming a spiritual leader. They are also in search of omnipotence. After they become enlightened, they may get into a different state. That's a different story altogether. But to begin with, and while they are struggling, which is 99% of their life, they are also in the search of the same thing. So this is what we see on an everyday basis, and we see it most dramatically and conspicuously when people project omnipotence on somebody and then relate to the person and feel ecstatic about it, like going to a celebrity and taking an autograph. How happy people are when they get it, or getting admiration from a CEO. When they come out of the cabin, the smile does not go off for 2 days. That is because you project omnipotence on that person, and when he admires, it is admiration from the omnipotent. Just look at how people go to even be near a celebrity or to touch a celebrity if he is around, as though he is not human, he is something suprahuman. So we see the projection of omnipotence, and we also see projection of omnipotence on ideologies, where people sacrifice themselves for the sake of what they believe to be the supreme truth. And this belief in the supreme truth has into it one component of projection of omnipotence. So we see how omnipotence arrives in psychoanalysis, and rightly so, and we see it in everyday life everywhere around us, that it almost seems as though we are there is no way it seems to be really free in our everyday normal life from being engaged with omnipotence directly or indirectly. Most importantly, because it is entangled with the infinity of desire.
I think to add to your point, there are so many movies as well where, there's a show of superpower in terms of a superhuman. If you take a Marvel movie, say Batman or Superman.
Right.
And I remember as a child, there was a constant question that keeps coming to my mind that if you had a superpower, what kind of a superpower would you want to have? I very distinctly remember being asked this question and as well asking the same question. And I think that stems from our innate nature of and the desire for and the search of omnipotence.
Desire is so pressing that we actually pay our hard-earned money to really experience this omnipotence vicariously if we cannot do it directly. So we identify with the hero or the heroine and we live it out vicariously. So I want to be as miraculously powerful and resilient as James Bond. I am not half of it. So I go to see a James Bond movie, identify with him, and live out that omnipotence vicariously for 3 hours. And then the shelf life of that experience is limited. So after a few days, I need a new dose because the desire for omnipotence has started pressing from inside again.
So, what is the nature of this search of omnipotence?
First, it is innate. It is not an acquired taste. It is not something that I sit and plan and I say, from next Monday 4:30, I will start the search for omnipotence. It's not that kind of thing. It is inborn. It's hardwired into us, embedded into the hardware. Second, it comes out very early in life by itself. The infant gives us many hints that he wants omnipotence. So across childhood, we can see the search for omnipotence, the desire to be omnipotent already there. Third, there are 3 aspects to this omnipotence. One, ideational aspect. The idea of omnipotence being the infinity of everything put together. The grand infinity, so to say. Second, the feeling aspect, that we feel ecstatic when we are near what we believe to be omnipotent. So in that experience of omnipotence, even if it's intrapsychic, there is a feeling of ecstasy. And even if it is in the real world that we are with a celebrity, again we feel the ecstasy. So there is a feeling component of this phenomena, the ecstasy. And the third is the visual component, where we almost feel like there is a splendor and we are dazzled by the splendor. So there is an ideational component, a visual component, and an affective component to this phenomena of omnipotence. In manifestation, we see there is something which is pragmatic movement, incremental movement towards omnipotence, a worldly wise pragmatic movement. And there is a surreal movement towards the omnipotence, a very wild, unstructured movement. The nature is also that it seems to be the goal of the infinity of desire. So when we say the infinity of desire, if here you have the infinity of desire, the goal is here. But if you look at this goal, this omnipotence, it's like a spear. It has power, it has looks, it has beauty, it has bliss, it has intellect. Right? So that omnipotence, the ultimate goal, has everything, and we can reach it through any route. We can think of infinite beauty touching that sphere in some sector. infinite power touching that sphere into some sector. So this is the kind of conceptualization that we have. In reality, obviously, nobody can reach there. So there's something which psychoanalysis tells us, natural frustration of human existence. That there is an infinity of desire, and the nature of things is such that we cannot satisfy the infinity of desire. We can only satisfy it partly. So that part which remains, the unfulfilled desire that remains. So there cannot be any human being without unfulfilled desires. And by that token, there cannot be any human being without frustration. However, how much we can reduce it to the minimum is something. So we are then looking at this omnipotence as an unattainable ideal, but we can definitely get close to it. And psychoanalysis, we'll see later, talks about optimization and not maximization. We are not going to be there. But how can we optimize our situation even if we are not there? And lastly, we see this surge of omnipotence right from childhood to the old age across life. And we see it manifesting everywhere. Even in the most practical of relationships, slowly the surreal starts coming in, and somehow or the other omnipotence makes its appearance. Either by creating the all good or creating the all bad. But it's very difficult to keep any human constellation free of omnipotence, no matter how rational the context is. That is, such is the power of this phenomena of omnipotence. And today we believe that there are three very important aspects, very fundamental aspects to human nature: pleasure, aggression, and narcissism. And you can put omnipotence in that narcissism. So pleasure, aggression, and omnipotence seem to be very fundamental, elemental entities in the very foundational arcade of the human nature.
So when we, and if I may call it an inevitable search for omnipotence, when we look at it starting from a very young childhood age, how do you relate it to the fulfillment of life?
Fulfillment is the word psychoanalysis is terrified of, because psychoanalysis is a secular science. Like any secular science, is terrified of the two ends of any argument: the ontological end of genesis and the teleological end of ultimate purpose. So these two areas of philosophy, ontology which deals with genesis and teleology which deals with purpose, most secular sciences keep away from these ends and allow them to be in the realm of philosophy. Now, if you look at the word fulfillment, it actually belongs proper to the teleological side. Now, what happens here is psychoanalysis, most schools of psychoanalysis, except for that of Carl Jung, don't talk so much of fulfillment. They talk of optimization. That there are limits to how far we can satisfy our desire. And if desire is not satisfied, then there are two ways out. One, reality acceptance and mourning of what has not been satisfied. Now, when we get into reality acceptance and mourning, this is the classical psychoanalytic way out, that once you do this, you reach an optimum position. And that optimum position is far from omnipotence. And the optimum position may not be fulfillment. It may just be the best possible, which may still be short of fulfillment. Carl Jung takes it to fulfillment, and he talks it's possible that we can have a very profound sense of fulfillment. And this, according to him, comes if individuation process goes on smoothly and we are in touch with our deeper nature and we are living an authentic life. Philosophically and spiritually, fulfillment takes another dimension, another contour. So there we look at fulfillment in two ways. Fulfillment comes from abundance and plenitude. Abundance on the material side and plenitude on the inner side. So plenitude in the inner world and abundance in the outer world, two put together can give us a sense of fulfillment. So when we look at omnipotence and fulfillment, the first idea that comes to us is that if we reach the state of omnipotence, we will have a sense of fulfillment. Second idea that comes to us is we are never going to reach a state of omnipotence. So is it that we are never going to reach a state of fulfillment? And there the divergences happen. So realistically, if we want fulfillment, it has to be fulfillment even if we are not at the state of omnipotence, because we are never going to reach there. No human being can reach there. So fulfillment always will be found somewhere short of omnipotence. And yet, even if we are not omnipotent, we can develop a sense of profound fulfillment. And how would that happen? That happens in many people by doing certain noble things, by living an authentic life, by intensely enjoying something very consciously, so that the desire burns out. Now, this is something unique to Indian spirituality, not to Western psychoanalysis. In the Western perspective, the desire never burns out, it just remains as it is. So there is no freedom from desire. It is beyond the limits of human potential. But in the Eastern perspective, it is within the limits of human potential. The limits of human potential are drawn far more liberally. So in the East, we believe it is possible by certain spiritual practices and personal development in evolution to be free from desire. So while desire can never be satisfied fully, freedom from it is possible. And in that freedom, one gets complete fulfillment. Now, what nature the fulfillment takes depends on the person. So we see enlightened people who are doing nothing, and we see enlightened people completely entangled in the, not entangled, but involved in the world. So that takes very different flavors. That group which finds fulfillment but does not involve in anything is what we refer to spiritually as the Avadut group. And the other is the one which is the Karma Yogi group, which is involved in the world completely. So we have here a complete continuum of how the fulfillment, even if one has, in a very profound way, manifests itself so differently in terms of flavors. So there, even though the subjects we are talking about have not reached the state of omnipotence, yet they have reached the state of fulfillment. So this is something which is very profound, and I think we can bring in one point of Lacan, where he says the goal has to be of therapy articulation of desire. Articulation so elaborate, so exhaustive, and so complete that even if desire remains unfulfilled, it does even then substantially exhaust itself. And in that exhaustion of desire, which is so profound, there is a sense of peace and some sense of fulfillment. So we see how the two are related. The first sight makes us believe the two will coincide, but a deeper inquiry reveals even if they are separate, far short of omnipotence, we can still aim for fulfillment, and it comes in different flavors.
So since we've spoken about fulfillment of life, and you spoke about the frustration that comes with this search, how does this frustration sort of play out in terms of pathology and just everyday life?
We see how in terms of pathology it plays out, that this whole force of desire, when it is frustrated, especially in very early life, it gives rise to a variety of pathological conditions. So we see how the search for omnipotence can develop very pathologically in the state of secondary narcissism and then stay with the person almost for his life unless he goes deep into himself. We also see how the identification with the omnipotent all good breast, when that gets into a situation of the object loss, how that object loss cannot be processed fully because you cannot let go of an omnipotent good object. You cannot process the loss of omnipotence. You cannot process the loss of such immense goodness you once had. And that object loss, because it cannot be processed, leads to so many personality disorders, be it narcissistic personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, and so on. We can also see how the search for omnipotence in some group of people leads even to psychosis. That the search for omnipotence is so intense and the real world is so harsh as it appears to them, that it hurts them so much that they first try to deal with the world, and when they cannot, it is too hurtful, they just withdraw into themselves and create a world of their own, which we call delusions and hallucinations. The whole world of psychosis. So in many cases of psychosis, we see the frustration of the inner desire for omnipotence leads to psychosis. And in some of them, you can see very distinctly that the person has a circumscribed psychosis. Meaning, in much part of his life, the person is completely okay. But in some component of his life, the psychotic problem makes its appearance. And when you try to heal the person just doesn't want to come out of his regression to primary narcissism. And you can see by the happiness on his face, the glow and the orgasmic pleasure on his face, how happy the person is, although he is suffering from psychosis. You don't see the gloom, the pain, the discontent on the face of the person, which we expect if he is suffering so much. Rather, we see an orgasmic bliss on his face. And that is because he has returned to the omnipotence of primary narcissism. And similarly, we see in creation of unhealthy self, be it a borderline self or a narcissistic self, right, that the early search for omnipotence was so thoroughly frustrated. We also see in everyday life, people projecting their omnipotence and living it out through celebrities. So we can see the viewership of The Crown. We can see how many people go to theaters to see James Bond movies or Rajinikanth movies or Superman or Batman movies. We can also see how people project omnipotence on somebody who is slightly narcissistic and then want to please that person and be near that person. So we also see in everyday life the other part of it, projection of omnipotence, of a bad omnipotence on somebody, and then you are terrified of the person. Say for example, excessive fear from police, excessive fear from political leaders, excessive fear from the boss, where the projection is of a bad omnipotent object. And when that happens, it becomes very difficult for the person to really do the job peacefully. He is under high amount of anxiety, stress, and rage, because on the boss he has projected the omnipotent bad object. So whoever is his boss, he has intense anxiety and rage towards that person. And the moment his boss is changed, his relationship improves. So it is not the person, it is just coincidental that anyone who is up in hierarchy, on him, the projection of all bad omnipotent breast will be made. So we can see how even in our occupational life, it happens. Even the personal life, it happens. And the projection of omnipotence is just everywhere. We just liberally throw these omnipotent projections on around us, and we just stumble through life. Nothing wrong with that. It's human to do that. I mean, there's nothing like a perfect body or a perfect mind. We are all stumbling through life. But the stumbling through becomes more acute because of unconscious pathology. And one of the difficulties is this of uh, the phenomena of omnipotence not managed well. And it cannot be managed well because we don't even know about it. Very few people would make out that this is at play. This is too deep for a lay person to make out by himself unless he is trained into it. This is not the type of knowledge which one can generate by oneself by analyzing one's experience. It's too deep for that. So you have to get trained, or you have to get educated in some way, instructed, informed, so that one understands this phenomena and then see it in oneself and then possibly manage it. So we see this phenomena everywhere. We see the ecstatic and the celebratory part of it, the surreal part of it, and we also see the tragic, terrifying part of it.
I think in terms of the constant pressure that I think as a layman, without not necessarily having understood this phenomena that you just explained, but I think there's a constant underlying notion that causes pressure to, for instance, a celebrity to be at their best behavior. Because there's always that underlying notion that what they endorse, the way they behave, what they say kind of influences and affects people. And I think another daily life example that I have kind of noticed is, especially in an Indian household, they always say that when you become a parent, you become extremely responsible. And don't worry, once you become a parent, you will imbibe that responsibility in yourself. And I think that comes from the notion that, hey, my child, I need to be the complete and the most maximal omnipotent example for my child, because my child is kind of going to imbibe his or her tendencies from me. So I think without really understanding this phenomena, there's already an underlying notion and understanding of the phenomena.
True. So this is the power of the unconscious phenomena, that they operate independently of our knowing or not knowing them. It's like the law of gravity. Even before it was discovered, it always was in operation.
Yeah, true.
So it is like a law of nature, and this phenomena of omnipotence, what happens very interestingly is, because there is a search for omnipotence, we cannot give up. If we cannot satisfy directly by ourselves, if we don't have the capability and luck to do it, we do it vicariously by identification. And in that, there are two parts. One, I can identify with somebody, like I can identify with a movie actor or a sports person who doesn't know me. So I identify vicariously, live out my omnipotence, I satisfy myself, I fantasize about that person, I dream, and it's done. But in the second situation, if I am in touch with that person, then what happens is, people do what is called projective identification. They put the omnipotence so intensely into that person that over a period of time, that person starts believing in it. And he starts acting as if he is partly that. So that's what people say. it's difficult to get the role out of the actor. That even after the role is over, the person keeps playing it. And that is because the omnipotence, projective identification of omnipotence is so intensely done, and it is so pleasing to the person on whom it is done, that he is not able to give up that seduction of that pleasure. And it is so addictive. I call it the addiction of seduction, in a very subtle, insidious psychological sense, that they themselves start believing in it. And we see this in film actors, in CEOs of companies, in very well-established political leaders, sports leaders, that if you see well-established leaders who have been at the top for 5-10 years, they actually start living out that omnipotence in a part way.
That's very interesting. So earlier you briefly introduced the concept of spirituality in this discussion. Is there a confluence of psychoanalysis and spirituality?
Psychoanalysis, being a secular science, usually keeps away from the concept of fulfillment, but omnipotence is a very central concept. There is no keeping away from omnipotence. In spiritual, but psychoanalysis primarily looks at omnipotence as something which is related more to pathology, except for Kohut. Kohut looks at omnipotence as a very natural developmental state, which we all have to satisfy and then move on to a realistic position. And when we should satisfy, if we don't satisfy, we remain fixated. And then the rest of the story happens. Jung is also not averse to pursuit of the omnipotence as a spiritual pursuit, and doesn't see it as largely pathological. But both of them are on the margins when it comes to this concept. The mainstream classical psychoanalytic community, Freudian, Kleinian, Bionian, all of them largely see omnipotence in the context of pathology. Spirituality sees it very differently, because spirituality looks at it in two different ways. And for that, we will have to deconstruct the spiritual arena into parts. So there is a part of spiritual arena which is into atheistic spirituality, where there is no concept of God. And then we have some the theistic spirituality, where there is a concept of God. And when it comes to omnipotence and fulfillment, both of them approach it differently. So in spirituality, we have three different opinions. The theistic spiritual schools, they say that because our souls have come from God, we were once upon a time part of the omnipotent. And there is therefore a search of our source, that we want to re-merge into omnipotence from where we have come. So it's a desire to go back home. And this is one of the most fundamental desires of our soul, because it appears as though we are shred off from a massive immensity, and now there is an urge to fuse back. And somewhere there is a memory of omnipotence once which was. So this is the explanation of the theistic school. Then we have another group of schools in spirituality which don't go into the concept of God, but they do say that there is soul, and when the soul develops itself fully, it becomes omnipotent. So there is omnipotence without the concept of God, second group of spiritual schools. And the third group of spiritual schools talks about that there is neither God nor the soul becomes omnipotent, but soul finds its fulfillment in the point of enlightenment when the desire burns out. So the infinity of desire never reaches omnipotence. The journey is never complete, but this infinity of desire burns itself out. So this corner drops. It is not that this corner reaches here. That never happens. Nobody can fulfill all his desires, but the desire burns out. And how to ensure the desire burns out? For that, there is this full spiritual process. So there are three different schools. Now, is there a confluence? There is a confluence in the sense that both psychoanalysis and spirituality recognize omnipotence to be a very important concept in the functioning of human mind. First. Second, both of them realize that fulfillment is not possible by reaching omnipotence. Third, fulfillment therefore has to be reached through some other route, and the other route seems to be the burning out of desire. Fourth, the difference is psychoanalysis does not believe desire can burn out, spirituality believes. And when it believes, the natural question then is, what are the tools to do it? And therefore, there are tools, a basket full of tools. Different approaches for different types of personalities and a basket full of tools. Another point of confluence is, if both of them believe that fulfillment should be reached, right, then there is a lot they can learn from each other in terms of concepts and tools. Spirituality has a lot to learn from psychoanalysis and psychoanalysis from spirituality, both in terms of model of the mind, working of the mind, pathogenesis, healing, and the tools for self-development and self-change. So there is a confluence. The difficulty is there is so much of split wide open that nobody is ready to really patiently listen and accommodate the other. The good part is I see some opening in spirituality for psychoanalysis, but it is still a long way before psychoanalysis can ever look at spirituality in a friendly way. So I recollect one of the comments made by a professor once. He says, psychology has come out of Department of Philosophy only 250 years back, and we don't want to go back there again. And this keeps them so fanatically anchored in the secular domain that unless something is empirically vetted out, they won't even touch it with a barge pole. I think it is too much of caution with too much of price, and it would do good if we can work more in the zone of confluence.
Does positive psychology, or as they call it, psychology gymnasium, have a role to play here?
Yeah, because in this search for fulfillment and in the search for omnipotence, whatever we can do, there are two generic ways. One, how do we reduce the negative in us, the difficulties in us, and how do we maximize the positive in us? The positive psychology approach is very good in enhancing the positive in us. Psychological gymnasium is very good in reducing the negative in us. Now, psychological gymnasium is not a standard term. It is something coined by me. The idea was, just as you have a gymnasium for the body, can we not have a gymnasium for the mind? And if yes, what should be the constituents of that gymnasium? And how that gymnasium can be used by different personalities, just as people with different problems make use of gym differently. So how can different personalities with different issues make use of that gymnasium? Can we have a gymnasium dedicated to anxiety, a gymnasium dedicated to depression? And just similarly, we can have other gymnasiums of more specialized type. So both of them have a very profound role to play. The positive psychology in enhancing the positive aspect of our lives, and the psychological gymnasium as a preventive and curative for the difficulties we have in the psychic life. With reference particularly to omnipotence and fulfillment, we can design positive psychology concepts and exercises, as well as the gymnasium concepts and exercises towards this particular goal, so that in 6 months' time, a person becomes well informed, more aware, experienced in managing this phenomena in himself, and also see it in others. And once so profoundly understood, the person is far better off than he was before.
I think the term coined by you, psychological gymnasium, is very interesting. I think it's going to stick with me and stick with all our viewers here. I think it kind of also stresses on the importance of how, while there's a gymnasium to look after your body, in terms of just furthering your desire to have a appealing body, or even putting in the work in terms of physiotherapy and things like that to strengthen your body. I think it stresses the importance of how your mind equally needs you to put in that kind of time and effort behind it.
One point I would like to add, which everyone can benefit from, the ability of psychology today to measure so many parameters. So just as you do a blood test to measure sugar levels, and there are so many, if you go for a health checkup package, they will monitor 65, 85 parameters and give you a report. Similarly, in psychology, there are so many tools today to measure your levels of anger, fear, pain, guilt, shame, envy. Right? You name the parameter and there is a standardized tool to measure it. It is just that people are not aware about it and therefore don't use it. But once they are aware of it, and in the psychological gymnasium, if we use these scientific tools, then apply the gymnasium and again use a scientific tool to see the difference after 3 months or 6 months, we can have a very scientific progress on a very predictable path using the scientific tools and the gymnasium together.
Yeah, there's also a study that I read recently about how your gut health is connected to incidents of depression and anxiety and all of that.
Yes, true.
Right. So we spoke about what the concept of search for omnipotence is, but how do you see this concept's evolution in the future, in the coming years?
First implication I see, if we acknowledge the significance of this concept, is to go back to the core concepts in each of the schools of psychoanalysis and revise those concepts in the light of this concept. For example, in the Freudian school, a very important concept is the concept of the Oedipus. So if we bring this idea of omnipotence there, how do we reconceptualize that phenomena? That if you are projecting the omnipotence on the parent of the opposite gender, then what happens? And when you enter the Oedipus, if the prior projection of omnipotence is not resolved, then you are entering something already with a difficulty. Go to the Kleinian school and revisit the concept of the split open, the paranoid schizoid split and the depressive position. Go to the split position. One of the ideas that Klein says the split does not close is the significance of the bad breast or bad experiences is too much compared to the good experiences. But what is not factored in is the addiction to the good breast, the seduction of the good breast, the ecstasy of the good breast. So it is the ecstasy related to the omnipotent good object, which does not allow you to leave the omnipotent good object and allow the split to close. So when we bring in the concept of omnipotence in that early life period, and the psychoanalytic unconscious movements which are necessary for health, not only psychological health, but even physical health. So the idea of omnipotence, if we take back and revise those fundamental concepts, it gets completely revised. Take the concept of omnipotence and go back to Kohut. It enriches what Kohut says. So one is reworking the core concepts of the fundamental schools in the fundamental concepts in the core schools of psychoanalysis and reworking them. That is one. Second, the significance of omnipotence, both good and bad, in pathogenesis, how pathology is created. Because we see the play of omnipotence, either positive or negative, in catastrophic thinking. That you project omnipotence on the challenge which you have. You magnify the challenge and you de-idealize yourself. Then you project omnipotence on the catastrophic consequences which can follow. You idealize somebody and de-idealize yourself. So the confidence goes away. You're not able to be the best version of yourself. You open up yourself to domination and exploitation in that projection. Then we look at the use of omnipotence in the structural model of the mind. How, when you conceptualize the model of the mind, this concept plays out. Then we look at an open model of the mind where we have a psychophilosophical model, not strictly a secular model. And there we can actually play upon the spiritual and philosophical concepts of omnipotence and link them to our model of the mind, which would be a blasphemy in classical psychoanalysis. Lastly, the positive aspect of it. How, if you put it in the right light and right context, how it can be a very noble and a positive inspiration for us. And if we move towards that path, how fulfilling we find small victories, small achievements on the way. And this can lead to a very high degree of fulfillment, even with much lesser degree of secular attainments. The discrepancy between the standard of life and the quality of life. That if we approach consciously and in a very profound thought out way on the path of our search for omnipotence, we get far better quality of life at much lower standards of life. Two important points which come in our way apart from ignorance, right, about this area, and that is there is a strange fear that what will happen if the search ends, and there is an envy of the solution itself. Now these are highly irrational but very strong unconscious movements which don't allow us to focus and proceed forward in many areas, including in this, that we recognize this concept, see it in ourselves and others, plan out how to manage, and move very consciously and with high degree of awareness and with intense feelings at every small project completed, which is well thought out profoundly before you actually start it. So this journey of omnipotence is very important to start, and wherever it ends will be much better than we were before.
That is very interesting. Thank you so much. It has been a very rewarding discussion. Do write to us at hveindia@gmail.com. And if you do have any comments or anything you would like to share with us, do mention it in the comments. Thank you so much. Namaste.
Namaste.